My sister laughed when I married a farmer. She stopped laughing when she realized who actually owned half the county. I'm Amanda, and this is the story of how my family's prejudice came back to bite them in the most spectacular way possible. You see, my sister thought she had it all figured out. She married what she called a finance genius, while mocking my choice to marry someone she dismissed as a lowly farmer. But sometimes the people who look down on others the most are the ones heading for the biggest fall. The mockery started the day I announced my engagement to David. We were all gathered around my parents' dining table for Sunday dinner when I showed them my ring. It wasn't the biggest diamond in the world, but it was beautiful, and more importantly, it came from a man who loved me unconditionally. "Oh, honey," my sister Rebecca said, barely glancing up from her phone. "It's cute, very rustic. I guess that fits with your whole farmer thing." She said the word farmer like it left a bad taste in her mouth. My parents exchanged glances across the table. Dad cleared his throat uncomfortably, while Mom forced a smile. "Well, we're happy if you're happy, sweetheart," Mom said, but I could hear the hesitation in her voice. Rebecca's husband, Marcus, leaned back in his chair with that smug expression I'd grown to hate. "No offense, Amanda, but don't you want more for yourself? I mean, what's his annual income? Does he even have a retirement plan?" I felt my cheeks burning, but David squeezed my hand under the table. He'd warned me this might happen. "Some people measure success differently than others," I said quietly. "Oh, come on," Rebecca laughed, setting down her phone. "Success is success. Marcus just closed another major deal this week. Show them the bonus check, honey." Marcus pulled out his phone and showed everyone a screenshot of a bank deposit. "Crypto investments," he said proudly. "I've got Amanda's farmer beat by about 10 years' worth of his salary. No offense." The worst part wasn't their attitude. It was watching my parents nod approvingly. They'd always favored Rebecca, the daughter who'd married well and lived in a fancy suburb. Meanwhile, I was choosing a man who worked with his hands and lived on land that had been in his family for generations. "At least I didn't marry a dirt farmer," Rebecca whispered to her friend at my wedding reception, loud enough for half the guests to hear. She was 3 glasses of champagne in and feeling particularly mean-spirited. The comments never stopped. Every family gathering became an opportunity for Rebecca to highlight the differences between our lives. She'd arrive in her luxury SUV wearing designer clothes, making sure everyone noticed her latest expensive purchase. Meanwhile, David and I would pull up in his practical pickup truck, and I'd watch my family's subtle disappointment wash over their faces. "How's the farming business?" Marcus would ask at every holiday, always with that condescending tone that suggested he already knew the answer wouldn't impress him. Social media became Rebecca's favorite weapon. She'd post photos of their lavish vacations, expensive dinners, and designer shopping sprees, always making sure to tag the family. When David and I posted pictures from our simple life, fresh vegetables from our garden, sunset views from our porch, our dogs running free across the property, Rebecca would comment things like, "So quaint," or "living the simple life." The breaking point came at Mom's birthday dinner last year. Rebecca had just returned from a spa weekend in Napa and couldn't stop talking about the adorable little vineyard they'd visited. "You know, Amanda," she said, cutting into her expensive steak, "you and David should visit sometime. though I guess farmers probably can't take vacations like that. She laughed like it was a joke, but her eyes were cold. We travel plenty, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. Oh, I'm sure you do. Where was your last trip? The county fair? Rebecca's friends giggled at her joke. David hadn't said much all evening, but I could see his jaw tightening. He was a patient man, but even he had limits. Actually, he said quietly, we just got back from our place in Montana. Rebecca's eyebrows shot up. Your place? You mean you rented a cabin? No, David said simply. We own it. The conversation moved on, but I caught Rebecca and Marcus exchanging confused glances. They'd built their entire superiority complex around the assumption that we were struggling financially. The idea that we might own property in multiple states didn't fit their narrative. But even that revelation didn't stop the mockery. If anything, it made Rebecca more aggressive. She couldn't stand the thought that her dirt farmer brother-in-law might have assets she didn't know about. Montana property is probably worth nothing anyway, she told Mom the next week. It's not like it's California real estate. The irony was that while Rebecca and Marcus were spending every penny they made trying to look successful, David and I were actually building something real. Our life wasn't flashy, but it was solid. We had land, livestock, and investments that Rebecca couldn't see because they weren't displayed in obvious ways. But my sister had no idea what was coming. She was so busy looking down on us that she never bothered to look at what was right in front of her. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning when my phone started ringing at 6 a.m. It was Rebecca, and she was crying. Amanda, you need to come over right now. Something terrible has happened. I threw on clothes and drove to her house, expecting to find a medical emergency or some kind of family crisis. Instead, I found Rebecca and Marcus sitting at their kitchen table, surrounded by financial documents and looking like they'd seen a ghost. What's wrong? I asked, genuinely concerned despite years of their condescension. The market crashed, Marcus said, his voice hollow. Everything we invested in, it's all gone. I sat down slowly, trying to process what they were telling me. What do you mean, gone? Rebecca's mascara was streaked down her cheeks. Marcus had us invested in this cryptocurrency fund. He said it was a sure thing. We put everything into it, our savings, our retirement, even took out a second mortgage on the house. It was supposed to be the investment of a lifetime, Marcus said defensively. All the indicators pointed to massive growth. The fund manager had an incredible track record. Had being the key word, Rebecca sobbed. The whole thing was a Ponzi scheme. The FBI raided their offices yesterday. We've lost everything, Amanda, everything. My heart sank despite everything they'd put me through. They were still family. How much are we talking about? Marcus couldn't meet my eyes. About $2 million, plus the house is leveraged. If we can't make the payments, we'll lose it all, Rebecca finished. The house, the cars, everything. We're going to have to declare bankruptcy. I felt terrible for them, but I also couldn't help thinking about all the times they'd mocked David's conservative approach to money. While they were chasing get-rich-quick schemes, he'd been building wealth slowly and steadily through traditional investments and land acquisition. I'm so sorry, I said, meaning it. What can I do to help? That's when Rebecca's tears stopped, and her expression hardened into something calculating. Actually, there might be a way out of this, but we need family to step up. She explained their desperate plan. They needed someone to co-sign on a massive loan to pay off their debts and keep the house. The problem was they'd already destroyed their credit, and no bank would touch them without significant collateral. "Your farm," Marcus said, looking at me hopefully. "It's got to be worth at least $500,000, right? If you and David could put it up as collateral." I stared at them in disbelief. "You want us to risk our home to bail you out of your investment mistakes?" "It's not a risk," Rebecca said quickly. "Marcus has a new job lined up. We'll pay everything back within 2 years, guaranteed." "But what if you can't?" "We will," Marcus insisted. "This is just a temporary setback. I've learned from my mistakes." The conversation continued for hours, with Rebecca and Marcus becoming increasingly desperate and manipulative. They reminded me of every favor they'd ever done for me, every time they'd helped with family events, every birthday gift they'd ever given. "This is what family does," Rebecca said, her voice taking on that edge I knew so well. "We help each other when times get tough. I would do the same for you without question." But I couldn't shake the memory of all those years of mockery and condescension. How they'd treated David like he was beneath them. How they'd made every family gathering uncomfortable with their constant reminders of our inferior lifestyle. When I got home and told David what had happened, his reaction surprised me. Instead of the anger I expected, he just looked sad. "I'm sorry they're going through this," he said quietly. "But Amanda, you realize what they're asking, right? They want us to risk everything we've built because they gambled away their future." We talked late into the night about what to do. Part of me felt guilty for even hesitating. They were family, after all. But another part of me couldn't forget how they'd treated us, how they'd never once acknowledged that their attitude toward David was hurtful and wrong. The pressure intensified over the next few days. Rebecca called multiple times a day, each conversation more desperate than the last. My parents got involved, calling to remind me of my family obligations. "You know your sister would do anything for you," Mom said during one particularly difficult phone call. "This is just temporary, and think about what it would mean to her children if they lose their home." Dad was more direct. "Amanda, you need to step up here. Rebecca is in real trouble, and you're the only one who can help." "What about you and Mom?" I asked. "Don't you have savings?" "We're already helping with what we can," Dad said, "but it's not enough. The farm is the only asset big enough to make a difference." On a tant, the final straw came when Rebecca showed up at our house uninvited, bringing the kids with her. She knew I had a soft spot for my nephew and niece, and she wasn't above using them to manipulate me. "Aunt Amanda," my 8-year-old nephew said, clearly coached, "Mommy says we might have to move away if you don't help us." I felt sick watching Rebecca use her children as emotional weapons. But it also crystallized something for me. This wasn't just about money, it was about respect. Rebecca had spent years treating David and me like we were less than her family. Now that she needed us, suddenly we were supposed to forget all of that and risk our security for hers. That evening, we made our decision. We would offer to help in other ways. Rebecca could stay with us while they got back on their feet. We'd help with job searching. We'd provide emotional support. But we wouldn't risk our land, our home, our future for people who had never respected us. When I called to tell Rebecca our decision, her reaction was explosive. You're seriously going to let your own sister lose everything because you're too selfish to help? Rebecca, we're willing to help in other ways. Other ways? She screamed. I don't need your charity, Amanda. I need you to act like family. But I guess I should have expected this from someone who married a farmer. Even in her desperation, she couldn't resist that final insult. The family meeting was called for the following Sunday. Rebecca and Marcus, my parents, and David and I all gathered in my parents' living room for what felt like a tribunal. Rebecca had spent the week rallying support, painting David and me as selfish and uncaring. Let me make sure I understand this correctly, Mom said, her disappointment evident. Your sister is facing bankruptcy and you're refusing to help because of some petty grudges? It's not about grudges, I said. It's about protecting our family's future. What about our family? Rebecca demanded. What about my children's future? Marcus jumped in, with charts and projections, trying to prove that their plan was foolproof. Look, I know I made mistakes with the crypto investment, but this is different. This is a solid business opportunity. I just need the collateral to get started. You're asking us to bet our home on your business acumen, David said quietly. The same business acumen that lost you $2 million. That was different, Marcus snapped. That was fraud. No one could have seen it coming. Actually, David said, his voice still calm, a lot of people saw it coming. That's why they didn't invest their life savings in promises of unrealistic returns. The room fell silent. Rebecca's face turned red with anger and embarrassment. Easy to say when you're sitting on that farm, playing it safe, she spat. Some of us actually tried to build something bigger than a little homestead, an increase. Speaking of which, Mom interjected, maybe it's time to be realistic about what that farm is actually worth. I know you love the lifestyle, Amanda, but we're talking about saving a family here. Surely a few acres and some animals aren't worth more than your sister's well-being. That's when David decided to speak up. And when he did, everything changed. Actually, he said, pulling out his phone, let me clarify something about our finances. He opened up an app I'd never seen before and handed the phone to my father. That's our current real estate portfolio. Dad's eyes widened as he scrolled through the screen. Mom leaned over to look, and her jaw dropped. I don't understand, Rebecca said, grabbing the phone. This says this can't be right. David reached into his briefcase and pulled out a folder of documents. Amanda's right that we own a farm. What she didn't mention is that we own several, along with about 12,000 acres across 4 states, 2 commercial properties, and a majority stake in the regional grain elevator. The silence in the room was deafening. Rebecca's face had gone completely white. But you're just a farmer, Marcus stammered. I am a farmer, David said simply. I'm also a 4th-generation landowner whose family has been acquiring property for over a century. My great-grandfather started with 40 acres. My grandfather expanded to 400. My father grew it to 2,000. I've been working to grow it further. He pulled out another document. This is the deed to the land where your house sits, Marcus. My family sold it to the development company 20 years ago, but we retained mineral rights and water rights. We've been collecting royalties on this subdivision since it was built. Marcus looked like he was going to be sick. You mean we've been paying you this whole time? Not directly. It goes through a management company, But yes, a portion of your HOA fees has been coming to us for 2 decades. Rebecca was staring at the documents like they were written in a foreign language. Why didn't you ever tell us? You never asked, David said. You were too busy telling us how unsuccessful we were. My mother was still scrolling through the real estate portfolio on David's phone. Amanda, why didn't you say anything? All these years we thought. You thought what, Mom? I asked, feeling years of hurt and frustration bubbling up. You thought I'd married beneath me? You thought David wasn't good enough for your daughter? We just wanted you to be secure, Dad said weakly. We are secure, I said. We've always been secure. But you were all so busy judging David's work clothes and his pickup truck that you never bothered to get to know the man I married. Rebecca was still staring at the documents, her face cycling through emotions, shock, embarrassment, anger, and something that might have been shame. So when you said you couldn't risk your farm, she started. I said we couldn't risk our home, I corrected. Because that's what it is to us, our home. Not because it's our only asset, but because it's where we've chosen to build our life together. Marcus had gone completely silent, probably calculating how many times he'd insulted a man who owned more land than he'd ever seen. The irony, David continued, is that we could probably cover your debts without leveraging anything. But that's not the point. Then what is the point? Rebecca asked, her voice barely a whisper. The point is respect, I said. For 7 years, you've treated my husband like he's less than human because he chooses to work the land instead of sitting in an office. You've made every family gathering miserable with your constant reminders of how much better you think you are. We never said, you didn't have to say it outright, Rebecca. It was in every look, every comment, every time you introduced Marcus as the finance expert while barely acknowledging David's existence. David stood up and began putting the documents back in his briefcase. For what it's worth, I'm sorry you're going through this financial difficulty. But we won't be providing the collateral you've requested. But you just said you could afford it, Marcus protested. I said we could afford it. I didn't say we would do it. There's a difference between having the resources to enable poor decision-making and choosing to use those resources wisely. Rebecca finally found her voice again, but it came out as a whisper. I can't believe this. All this time I thought, you thought you were better than us, I finished. You thought you'd married up while I'd married down. You thought your husband's financial expertise made him superior to my husband's agricultural knowledge. You were wrong about all of it. The meeting ended in stunned silence. My parents didn't know what to say. Rebecca and Marcus were too shocked to argue. And David and I had finally said everything we'd been holding back for years. As we drove home, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that the truth was finally out, that my husband's worth had been recognized, that years of condescension had been exposed for what they were. But sadness, too, because it had taken a financial crisis to force this conversation. Do you think we did the right thing? I asked David as we pulled into our driveway. He looked out at the land that stretched as far as we could see. Land that his family had worked and loved for generations. Land that Rebecca had dismissed as worthless dirt. I think we did the honest thing, he said, and sometimes that's the same as the right thing. But the story wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning, because while the truth had been revealed, the consequences were still playing out. And Rebecca, wasn't the type to accept humiliation quietly. The phone calls started the very next morning. Rebecca had clearly spent the night processing everything that had been revealed, and she'd moved from shock to desperate anger. "Amanda, you can't just walk away from this," she said when I answered her call at 7 a.m. "I'm your sister. Family doesn't abandon family." "We're not abandoning you, Rebecca. We've offered to help in other ways." "Other ways?" Her voice was getting shrill. "I don't need you to let me sleep on your couch, Amanda. I need you to act like family and help me save my home." The irony wasn't lost on me. After years of treating David and me like second-class family members, suddenly Rebecca wanted to invoke the sacred bonds of sisterhood. "You had no problem treating David like he wasn't family for 7 years," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my own voice. "That's different. We were just teasing." "Teasing?" I felt my anger flare. "Rebecca, you called my husband a lowly farmer at my wedding reception. You've spent years making sure everyone knew you thought I'd married beneath me. That wasn't teasing, that was cruelty." There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Rebecca tried a different approach. "Look, I know we haven't always gotten along perfectly, but this is bigger than hurt feelings. My children could lose their home, Amanda. Their school, their friends, their whole life. Is your pride really worth more than their stability?" It was a masterful manipulation, bringing the children into it, making it about my pride rather than her behavior. But I'd learned to recognize these tactics from David, who dealt with manipulative people in business for years. "This isn't about pride, Rebecca. This is about making responsible decisions with our family's resources." "Your family's resources?" she snapped. "I'm your family." "So is David. So are any children we might have someday. My responsibility is to protect our future, not to enable your poor choices." The conversation ended with Rebecca hanging up on me, but it was far from over. She spent the next week mounting what I can only describe as a campaign against us. First came the extended family. Suddenly, aunts and uncles I hadn't heard from in years were calling to express their concern about Rebecca's situation and their disappointment in my selfishness. Somehow, the story had been twisted into David and me hoarding wealth while refusing to help a struggling family member. "Your cousin Jenny called," Mom told me during one of her increasingly frequent check-ins. "She's very upset about how you're handling this situation. She said the whole family is talking about it." "What exactly are they saying, Mom?" "Well, they're saying that you have more money than you could ever spend, and you're letting your sister lose her home over some petty grudge." Did Rebecca tell them about the years of disrespect? About how she and Marcus treated David? Mom was quiet for a moment. "She said you were holding on to old hurts that weren't that serious." The gaslighting was impressive, even for Rebecca. She'd managed to rewrite 7 years of condescension and mockery as minor sibling squabbles, while painting herself as the victim of our unreasonable grudge. Social media became another battlefield. Rebecca's posts were carefully crafted to garner sympathy without directly attacking us. Photos of her children looking sad, with captions about difficult times and learning who your real family is. Friends and family members who didn't know the full story began commenting with support for Rebecca and subtle criticism of unnamed family members who weren't stepping up. But the most painful manipulation came through my parents. Rebecca had clearly worked on them because their calls became increasingly guilt-focused. "Honey, I think you need to really consider what's important here," Dad said during what felt like an intervention. "Rebecca made some mistakes, yes, but she's learned from them. Marcus has a solid plan to rebuild, and you have the power to save your sister's family." "What about David's feelings in all this?" I asked. "What about the way they've treated us?" "David seems like a forgiving man," Mom interjected. "I'm sure he understands that family comes first." The pressure was relentless. Every day brought new calls, new guilt trips, new attempts to wear us down. Rebecca had clearly decided that if she couldn't appeal to our sense of family loyalty, she'd make our lives miserable until we gave in. David watched me struggle with the emotional manipulation for about a week before he decided enough was enough. "We need to set some boundaries," he said one evening after I'd spent an hour on the phone with my increasingly hostile mother. "This campaign they're running is affecting your health." He was right. I wasn't sleeping well, wasn't eating much, and spent most of my day fielding calls from family members who'd been fed Rebecca's version of events. "What kind of boundaries?" I asked. "The kind that protect our peace and our marriage," he said firmly. "Amanda, I've watched toxic people operate in business for years. This is a classic manipulation campaign. Rebecca is trying to isolate us, exhaust us, and make us so miserable that we'll give in just to make it stop." That night, we made some decisions. We would no longer accept daily calls about Rebecca's situation. We would not engage with family members who'd been fed one-sided information, and we would not attend any more family meetings designed to pressure us into changing our minds. The boundary setting started the next morning when Rebecca called at her usual time. "I'm not going to discuss your financial situation anymore," I told her before she could launch into her prepared speech. "We've made our decision and it's final." "You can't just cut me off, Amanda. I'm your sister." "I'm not cutting you off. I'm setting a boundary. We can talk about other things, how you're feeling, how the kids are doing, what your plans are for moving forward. But I won't be guilted or manipulated into changing our decision about the loan." Rebecca tried several more approaches during that call. Tears, anger, threats to cut contact with us permanently. When none of them worked, she escalated. "Fine," she said, her voice cold, "but don't expect me to forget this. And don't expect the family to forget it either. You're choosing money over your own sister. Everyone will know what kind of person you really are." The threat was clear, but it also revealed something important. Rebecca wasn't actually interested in rebuilding our relationship or addressing the years of disrespect. She was interested in getting our money, and when that didn't work, she was interested in punishment. The family gossip campaign intensified after that. Suddenly, every family event became an opportunity for subtle digs and pointed conversations about loyalty and sacrifice. David and I found ourselves increasingly isolated from people who'd known me my entire life. But something unexpected happened during this period. As the pressure mounted and the manipulation became more obvious, I started to see my family dynamics more clearly. I began to understand how Rebecca had always operated, using guilt, emotional blackmail, and social pressure to get her way. And I realized that my parents had been enabling this behavior for decades. The breaking point came at my cousin's wedding 2 months later. Rebecca had spent weeks positioning herself as the tragic figure, the devoted mother and wife, facing hardship while wealthy family members turned their backs. By the time we arrived at the reception, the narrative was firmly established. "Oh, Amanda," my aunt pulled me aside early in the evening. "I'm so sorry to hear about everything that's happening with Rebecca. It must be so hard for you to see her struggling when you're doing so well." The implication was clear. I was somehow responsible for Rebecca's struggles, or at least responsible for not fixing them. David handled it better than I did. When my uncle made a comment about some people who have forgotten where they came from, David simply nodded and said, "It's interesting how financial crises can really reveal people's true characters." But Rebecca had saved her biggest manipulation for last. During the wedding reception, when most of the family was gathered together, she made what amounted to a public plea. "I know this isn't the right time or place," she said, approaching our table with tears in her eyes. "But I can't stop thinking about my children. They don't understand why we might have to move away from everything they've ever known. I keep trying to explain that sometimes family can't help even when they have the resources to do so." The table went silent. Every family member within earshot was now watching this carefully orchestrated scene. Rebecca had positioned herself as the heartbroken mother while casting us as the heartless relatives who could solve everything but chose not to. David stood up slowly. When he spoke, his voice carried across several nearby tables. "Rebecca, I think it's time we had an honest conversation about resources and responsibility." He pulled out his phone and opened the banking app he'd shown my parents weeks earlier. "You're right that we have resources. What you haven't mentioned is how those resources were acquired." He turned the phone so the nearby tables could see the screen. "This represents 4 generations of careful financial planning, conservative investments, and living below our means. My great-grandfather saved every penny to buy his first 40 acres. My grandfather worked 16-hour days to expand the farm. My father sacrificed luxuries to continue growing our holdings. And Amanda and I have continued that tradition." The reception had gotten quiet enough that David's voice was carrying to most of the room. "What this doesn't represent is gambling on cryptocurrency, taking out second mortgages to fund investments, or spending beyond our means to maintain a lifestyle we couldn't afford." Rebecca's face was getting red, but David wasn't finished. "Amanda and I live in the same farmhouse my grandparents built in 1952. We drive practical vehicles. We take modest vacations. We save and invest methodically. We've never asked anyone in this family for financial help. And we've never judged anyone for their career choices or lifestyle decisions." Now he turned to look directly at Rebecca. "But we've been judged for ours. For 7 years, we've been treated like second-class family members because I work with my hands instead of sitting in an office. For 7 years, you've made it clear that you considered your lifestyle superior to ours." The room was completely silent now. David's voice remained calm, but his words were carrying the weight of years of accumulated hurt. "Now you want us to risk our family's security that was built over generations through discipline and hard work, to bail you out of the consequences of your own financial choices. And when we declined, you launched a campaign to turn our entire family against us." He put his phone away and looked around the room at all the relatives who'd been pressuring us for months. I want everyone here to understand something. We didn't refuse to help because we're selfish or because we don't care about family. We refused because we don't believe that enabling irresponsible behavior is the same thing as helping. And we refused because respect is a two-way street. You can't treat people like they're beneath you for years and then expect them to sacrifice their security for your poor decisions. David sat back down, leaving Rebecca standing alone in front of a room full of people who were suddenly seeing the situation differently. The aftermath was swift and decisive. Several family members approached us that evening to apologize for their involvement in pressuring us. Others admitted they'd only heard Rebecca's side of the story and hadn't realized how badly she'd treated us over the years. My uncle, who'd made the snide comment earlier, came over to shake David's hand. "Son, I owe you an apology. I had no idea about the history here. What you built is impressive, and how you've handled this whole situation shows real character." But the most important conversation happened with my parents the following week. They came to our house, the first time they'd visited us in months, and sat down at our kitchen table, looking ashamed. "We owe you both an apology," Dad said without preamble. "We let Rebecca manipulate us into pressuring you, and that was wrong. We also owe David an apology for years of subtle disapproval," Mom added. "We were so focused on what we thought success should look like that we couldn't see the success you'd actually built." The conversation lasted for hours. For the first time in years, my parents really listened as David and I explained how their attitude had affected us, how Rebecca's constant mockery had hurt, and how the recent pressure campaign had damaged our trust. "We're proud of you," Mom said finally. "Both of you. What you've built together is remarkable, and how you've handled this situation shows wisdom and strength. It wasn't a complete repair. Years of hurt don't disappear overnight, but it was a beginning." Rebecca's response to the wedding confrontation was predictable. She doubled down on her victim narrative, claiming that David had publicly humiliated her and that our family had chosen money over relationships. A few family members bought into this version, but most had seen and heard enough to form their own opinions. Within 6 months, Rebecca and Marcus had declared bankruptcy and moved to a rental house across town. The children adjusted better than Rebecca had predicted. Kids are resilient, and they were actually happier in a home, without the constant stress of financial pressure and their parents' toxic dynamic. Marcus got a job with a steady salary and no commission or investment component. The humbling experience had taught him the value of predictable income over get-rich-quick schemes. Rebecca struggled more with the adjustment, but gradually began to understand that their previous lifestyle had been built on unsustainable debt rather than real wealth. The most significant change was in our family relationships. The crisis had forced everyone to examine long-held assumptions about success, worth, and family loyalty. Some relationships were damaged beyond repair, but others emerged stronger and more honest. David and I found ourselves with a new appreciation for what we'd built together. The outside pressure had tested our marriage and our values, and we'd emerged more confident in our choices and more united in our commitment to each other. "Do you ever regret not helping them?" I asked David one evening as we sat on our porch, watching the sunset over land that his family had worked for generations. He considered the question seriously before answering. I regret that it took a crisis to force these conversations. I regret that Rebecca and Marcus had to learn such expensive lessons. But I don't regret protecting our family's future. He reached over and took my hand. And I don't regret finally standing up for us, for our choices, and for the life we've built together. Looking back, I realized that the whole experience taught me something crucial about family, boundaries, and self-respect. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is refuse to enable destructive behavior. Sometimes protecting your own well-being is more important than keeping peace. And sometimes the people who claim to love you are actually the ones preventing you from living authentically. Our relationship with Rebecca never fully recovered, but it did evolve into something more honest. She eventually apologized for years of condescension, acknowledging that her attitude had been wrong and hurtful. We developed a more distant but respectful relationship, based on clear boundaries rather than forced intimacy. The experience also brought unexpected benefits. Our story became a touchstone for other family members dealing with similar situations. My younger cousin reached out when her siblings were pressuring her to co-sign a loan she couldn't afford. A family friend called for advice when her adult children were demanding she liquidate her retirement savings to fund their business venture. We learned that financial boundaries are often relationship boundaries in disguise. When people respect your decisions and your resources, they're usually respecting you as a person. When they don't, it often reveals deeper issues about how they see you and your worth. Most importantly, the crisis strengthened my marriage and clarified my values. David and I had faced external pressure, family manipulation, and social isolation, and we'd emerged more committed to each other and more confident in our choices. Sometimes people ask if we would handle things differently if we could do it all over again. The answer is no. We would still refuse the loan, still set the boundaries, still prioritize our family's security over enabling destructive behavior. But we might have had some of those difficult conversations earlier. We might have addressed the years of disrespect before it built up into resentment. We might have been clearer about our expectations for how family members should treat each other. The truth is, respect can't be demanded or bought. It has to be earned and maintained. Rebecca spent years eroding the respect in our relationship through her attitude and behavior. When she needed our help, she discovered that respect is also the foundation for trust, generosity, and family support. In the end, we all learned valuable lessons about money, family, and the difference between enabling and helping. Rebecca learned that real security comes from living within your means, not from having family members willing to bail you out of bad decisions. Our parents learned that success takes many forms, and that judging people based on their career choices says more about the judge than the judged. And David and I learned that standing up for your values and your relationship is worth the temporary discomfort of family disapproval. We learned that boundaries aren't walls, they're gates that let in respect while keeping out manipulation. Our life today is quieter but more authentic. We still live on the farm that Rebecca once dismissed as worthless dirt. We still drive practical vehicles and take modest vacations. But we do it all with the confidence that comes from knowing we've built something real, something lasting, and something that reflects our values rather than other people's expectations. And sometimes, when the phone rings early in the morning, it's not a crisis or a guilt trip or a manipulation. Sometimes it's just Rebecca calling to check in, to share news about the kids, or to ask for advice about something she's considering. The conversation is respectful, boundaried, and honest. It took a financial crisis, a family confrontation, and some very difficult conversations. But we finally have the relationship we should have had all along. One based on mutual respect rather than assumed superiority. And that, more than any amount of money, feels like real wealth.